I was just thinking about just the concept of Israel. Do you think it's accurate to describe it really as a settler colony? I mean, this is really kind of a war that's being waged by these sort of new colonial settlers that are fighting the people that they displaced. Is that pretty accurate description?
Yeah, I think it is. There's just no question about it. Um, yeah, I mean, they took the land, and and they in 1948 they seized a great piece of Palestine, and now they're in the process of seizing more. Both in the West Bank and Gaza, and it's a process that never stopped. Of course, it was especially since the 1967 war. It was very gradual, it was incremental, in the West Bank, but it never stopped. And now it's accelerating, and it's accelerating in a way, especially in Gaza, where everyone can see it. I think there's no question that whatever happens in Gaza, Israel intends to seize more of it for itself.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. It's interesting. I think to look at it in that framework, I think is a good way to look at it because kind of the creation of Israel was happened really at the when all these other colonial settlements were being kind of were falling apart or not really falling apart, say returned back to the
Uh-huh.
indigenous peoples. And I was just
Right.
thinking maybe you can talk a little bit about comparing the types of colonialism that we've seen because you are actually born in a settler colony. You were born in Uganda, Kampala, while it was
Right.
still
Well,
ruled under the
yeah,
British, right?
it was a colony. I wouldn't call it a settler colony because there were very few Brits who had settled there. It was governed by Great Britain, but it wasn't settled by them. Now, there are other ones, if you want to look at Rhodesia or South Africa, that's okay. South Africa is a more complicated case, but Rhodesia definitely, and then Kenya too. There was a lot of land farm that was farmland that was, you can say, occupied by British settlers, but that wasn't true in Uganda. It was a colony. It was run by the British up until shortly after my birth in 1962. It was a protectorate. I think that was the official status of the British Empire, when I was born, and then it gained its independence not long afterwards. Um, now, yeah, in general, actually, the feelings of the Ugandan peoples, you say peoples because they're really very diverse group of tribes there, was in general positive towards the British. That it was, especially in light of some of the horrors that Uganda experienced afterwards. Idi Amin and Milton Obote, hundreds of thousands of people were killed in persecutions and civil conflict. And they look back at that time under the British as being relatively idyllic. So there wasn't, when the British left, there wasn't any much hostility. Now, things are very, very different, of course, in Palestine because it's not that the Jewish people came and simply governed the people that were there, established a government over them, but expelled them from the land. Again, it was approximately 750,000 that were expelled in the Nakba in 1948. And then,
Was there anything
go ahead.
comparable to, previous, colonial like settlements that we in the past we could look upon historically, or is Israel really just kind of very unique in the way that it's driven to reclaim this land completely and to completely displace it? Because when we talk about, like Uganda or Kenya, like you said, it was more governing. They established institutions, maybe they controlled a lot of the means of production or whatever, but the goal wasn't to rid the land of these people. That was never the
Right,
goal in
right.
Uganda or whatever. There was a lot of brutality, especially here in the Congo under the Belgians, but was there anything comparable like this before? Is there a historical parallel
Well,
that
I
we
think
can look upon?
probably, I mean, I think the American experience is probably the best comparison. I mean, the Native Americans, the Indians were driven from their lands. The March of Tears in Tennessee, right?
Hmm.
Um, uh, I think that's probably the best comparison.
Do Israelis use that as kind of a justification? They say like a lot of them
I have
came
ne
from.
Right. I have never heard them use that as a justification. They may have. I've heard actually people who are not necessarily like Zionists saying, okay, well, we got to accept Israel. It's kind of like, we drove the Indians from the land, but now it's just a historical fact. It was wrong, but it just happened, and that's okay. Israel's there, and we just have to live with it. Just
Mhm.
like, okay, yeah, that age is past. The Indians are gone. They're very small. They're very small in numbers, and they live on these reservations, and that's just a fact that we really can't change at this point. It's not like all the people, the population of New York is going to get up and move somewhere else and bring the Iroquois back in. That just can't happen. Um, so that doesn't quite work because it's much more recent in history, and there are Palestinians living now, quite a few who were born on what's now called Israel, and they remember quite well. They're still there, and they still want to come back. And so it's not something in the deep past, and also the populations that we're talking about are quite a bit larger. There are a lot of people that I understand themselves to be Palestinians that live in places like, not just the West Bank and in Gaza, but in Lebanon and Jordan and elsewhere. And they consider that their home.
Yeah,
So right. So I mean, it's similar to the American experience in the fact that people, just Indians were clearly driven from their land in different parts of the U.S. As the settlers, expanded, but otherwise it's different. I mean, again, there's just when you talk about relative numbers and also it's simply the fact that it's much more recent. It's nothing in a it's not something that's so far in the past that we can just speak about it as something purely historical matter. It's a living matter. It's a burning issue that needs to be resolved.
I think most Israelis and Jews and Christian Zionists, people that support Israel, will say, well, this isn't actually really a settler colony because this is their original homeland. That if you do architectural digs or you look at old texts, then you can say that this is the land of the Jews, so that they claim that they're not a settler colony. How would you just argue against that?
Well, yeah, I imagine if you actually use that um, as the basis for deciding who should live where, it, we I think let's say most people find themselves on land that was once occupied by somebody else 2,000 years ago. And you could use if you could use that argument to expel these people who have lived there for 2,000 years or longer. It's not like they necessarily even they could have been there when it was actually considered to be Israel in ancient times. If you could use that as the justification for driving them from the land, I'm sure you can find similar justifications based on archaeological digs, all around the world, and we would have a huge mess and all kinds of injustice on our hands.
Yeah, no, that argument I think is absolutely ridiculous. I just wanted to see how you'd respond to it because if you go back in time, everybody's moving everywhere constantly. If you start trying to look historically, like, well, I got Norwegian ancestry or Taiwanese ancestry, I'm allowed to go back, and or all the
Hmm.
Irish here in America are going to go back to to Ireland or whatever. It's an absurd line of thinking, but there is that really strong belief that there is this right to return, and then that's what Israel has, that program, the right to return program, to
Yeah,
sort of import the Jews from around the world to Israel. It I just wonder how they can square that justification with the rest of the world. How is it that Israel gets to say that that's okay, but no other people can say that
yeah,
I have the right to return to some other
right.
ancestral land?
Yeah, I think in the end, just no matter how you look at it, the Israelis, I really should say, the Israeli Jews have you can say, an exclusivist, a supremacist, an exceptionalist argument. In the end, it's just like it's we're the Jews and we're special. And frankly, the people who support Zionism, in the end, they wouldn't actually put forward these arguments for anything else. But it's simply because these are the Jews and they're special. We're talking about the fact that these colonies were were being returned to the indigenous peoples, all around the world, British colonies, French colonies, sometimes peacefully, as the case of my native country, Uganda, sometimes violently, as in Vietnam or Algeria. But there was this process that was just that I think everybody came to realize was just irresistible. It was an irresistible force. But the one exception to it was was the Jews in Palestine. And everything else, all the arguments that everybody accepted, for the liberation of these various peoples around the world, somehow did not apply to Palestinians. I mean, you just kind of change the names and you say, instead of Palestinians and Jews, we have Black Africans and Dutch colonists. And then you see if anybody can try to make the argument that they make for it to justify Zionism, in other words, the settlement of Palestine by Jews. Make that same kind of argument for any other group, and then you would find, just it just wouldn't work. It's only because there is this exceptionalism that surrounds the Jews, that the Jews, many Jews themselves believe in, and a lot of the supporters of Zionism believe in, including, of course, Christian Zionists.
But how and why? How does that happen? It's just so it's just so obvious. I mean, I feel like most people, they just know it down in their bones that there's something wrong with what's happening. I mean, I feel like the Israelis have to some extent. I mean, they just
Yeah,
bury it, but this conflict that's happening in Gaza is just so horrific, and it's so public that the whole world sees it. Everybody understands what's happening. Most people, I would say, the majority of the world knows what Israel is doing is wrong, and they want Israel to stop.
yeah,
But for we've talked about this ad nauseum, but it just all of our politicians in America, they won't say anything about it. And the same thing with Western Europe, even though most people are seeing it, and it's not a black and white, not a nuanced or a gray thing. It's a very black and white situation that most people see
hmm,
happening. But there's no political power or will in the West to change it. Whereas even with something like, for example, Ukraine, I think that for a lot of the Western population, most people, that's a bit more convoluted. They don't maybe fully understand, and so a
yeah,
lot of people will be supporting Ukraine, and they think like, oh, they don't quite get it. But you will have politicians like RFK or Trump or JD Vance that will be like, yeah, this war has to stop. Or even now popping up in Europe, it's becoming more and more popular for politicians to oppose what we're doing in Ukraine, to stop the NATO expansion and the military support to try to keep this war going. That is dying at a fast rate, but in Gaza it's not the same thing. Even though it's so clear that what Israel is doing is wrong, and I keep on trying to square that away. I'm like, everybody knows what's happening. How did they keep on getting away with it? And how did they? It's just, you talk about this exceptionalism that they can, some support from Christian Zionists, but it just doesn't add up to me. I don't get
yeah.
it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot in life and human society that's irrational and kind of ultimately just resists any kind of analysis. I mean, it's just sometimes all you can say is it's there. It may not make sense, but it's there. There are these deep emotional attachments to Israel. I mean, um, you can explain it in part. I mean, I think, like in the case of the United States, okay, we've discussed the phenomenon of Christian Zionism, which is a bizarre phenomenon in itself. But it's there, it's real. But there are a lot of people like RFK, who's not a Christian Zionist, nor is he Jewish, but he is emotionally committed to Israel. And that too is a phenomenon because we're talking about the political elite, and certainly RFK is part of the political elite. You find a lot of people, or Joe Biden himself. Okay, Joe Biden is an Irish Catholic, so-called. He's not Jewish, he's not a Christian Zionist, but he's a fervent Zionist. Um, Now, how did this happen? Well, I think in part you do have to look at the influence of Hollywood and the media, and you do have to look at Jewish influence in the United States, because those are two areas where it's just a fact. Okay, this is not some crazy conspiracy theory. It's a fact that those two very important sectors are part of, you could call them like factories of they're cultural factories. They produce the movies that we see, the news that we read and consume, and so therefore they really inform the thinking of Americans. And those two sectors of society are very much dominated by Jews, which have been, up until this time, and is still true. I think maybe it won't be. Perhaps it won't be true in 20 years because we see a phenomenon of younger Jews starting to break away from Zionism. But it's still true that Jews tend to be Zionists, very, very much committed to the Zionist project. And that has affected the news that people have consumed and the movies they've seen. They see a movie like Exodus, right? I've had people tell me that, that really affected me. This was something that hits people at a deep level, and maybe they'll see a movie like that as a kid, or they'll watch. There was a Holocaust series I remember that came out during the '70s, and that affected people a lot, very deeply. So these are things they're currents that run deep in our culture. And it's not easy to change. These people have these very deep-seated feelings, these that support very powerful commitments to political programs, in this case, to the Zionist project. So when you're fighting Zionism in the US, you're up against a lot. You're up against Jewish Zionists, you're up against Christian Zionists. They're separate phenomena, but they obviously support more or less the same thing. And then you have these other people who are neither, but who have been convinced that Zionism is something almost holy.
I think that that's very true. It's a big part of, at least here in the United States, this idea that
And then it's
Zionist is a
just like
holy
the
thing.
power of the United States is such that uh, you that it ends up shaping. Maybe not so much. Again, you do find much more dissent in Europe, in places like France and Britain, and so on. The but these countries, these governments have become basically vassal states. And so they respond more to the power of the United States, the directions that they receive from the United States, than they do to the sentiments of their own people. And I think you can see that very clearly.
It, do you think that politicians like Joe Biden and RFK Jr., Donald Trump, do they share the same dream as the Israelis to create greater Israel? Because this is really the focus of the problem is that Israel won't stop taking land and and continually to ethnically cleanse the land. Like if they pulled back to where the 67 internationally recognized boundaries are, then potentially we could have a two-state solution and they can, maybe not live in complete harmony. They may not like each other, but at least the killing would stop, and Israel could maintain its borders there, and Palestine here,
Hmm.
and this would just be something that we could all agree is fair. Okay, Israel, you got your state. It's a little sketchy how you did it, but it's done. Here it is. Here's the 67 line. But you
Yeah.
can't have this open air prison Gaza where you have a policy called mowing the lawn, where every couple of years you go
Hmm.
in and just start massacring people, and you can't just constantly pour into the West Bank of Palestine and just take over homes and bulldoze settlements and then build your own little
Yeah.
settlement in the
Okay.
middle there. Like that's
Yeah. Cut down olive groves. And
right. Cut down all of those. So is that something that people that you think
it,
these Zionists support? Because they always say they want a two-state
yeah.
solution.
I don't think so. I think RFK is a decent man, just to give one example. And I don't think Biden himself, supports the these really bloody fantasies of people like Smotrich and Netanyahu, for that matter. I think they have an idealized version of Israel in their head. They believe that somehow it is that Zionism is holy, and the Jewish state is sacrosanct, and must always be supported. And unfortunately, there are some crazies there. Just like America is a great country, but unfortunately, we have some bad people in the Republican Party or in the Democrat Party, whatever. But these are, it's basically a good place, and I think they should be seeing what's happening now. There are a lot of people who thought that way, actually, and no longer do. Their minds have been changed over the last several months because of the horrors, that have been perpetrated in Gaza. But, maybe especially among older people, it's really hard to wake up. You just feel like Israel's Israel, and you hear something, these accusations, they seem to like wild accusations, and you just brush them aside and say, well, it can't be, it's just some sort of, lefty propaganda, or it's of course, occasionally mistakes are made in war, collateral damage and all that, and they're just exaggerating it. I'm sure that's what RFK and is doing, for example. He just can't see it because he has that deep emotional commitment that he's it's just narrowed his vision and has prevented him from seeing what's really going on.
It's just such a powerful force that I keep on coming back to this question. I know I always pepper you with it, like,
Yeah.
how
Well,
does this happen?
yeah,
Why does it?
yeah.
How can we?
Well, it is. Well, it's extremely important. I mean, it may be. Who knows? This is the force that may bring down, lead to a world war, if not a major regional war. This is the force that may lead to the first use of nuclear weapons since Nagasaki. This is the force that may, in the end, really bring down the United States, because we have hitched our wagon to this entirely, our foreign policy, and we have already, because of this force, Zionism, we have our reputation around the world has taken a huge beating,
Yeah,
and it's only going to get worse.
yeah. Maybe could you explore that a little bit more, just about how isolated the United States is becoming because of its commitments to Israel and to Ukraine, and just the impacts that's going to have on us.
Yeah, well,
What's
you can
the
see it
evidence
most.
of the isolation? We'd
Well,
start
you
with
can see
that.
it most clearly in UN votes. Recent, we haven't had one recently, but a couple months ago, whenever we have a vote on Israel and Gaza, um, we again and again will find that there's maybe not even a dozen countries in the world that stand with Israel, but it's always the U.S. is with them. The others tend to be, with the exception of, I think recently there was Hungary and the Czech Republic that stood with Israel, and then it was just tiny little nothing states like Fiji and the U.S. I mean, it's clear you have votes, and this goes way back. It's not even, this is not a recent phenomenon. This is something that goes back decades. Again and again, when votes are taken on the question of Israel and Palestine, the support for Palestine and for the two-state solution. There was a UN resolution that was passed, actually with the support of the United States, if I remember correctly, shortly after the Six-Day War, that called for just that, for recognition of the original pre-1967, or I should say pre-Six-Day War boundaries as the proper international boundaries that should be the basis for a two-state solution. And again, the world has supported that and supported the Palestinians, efforts to bring that about. And then the one force, well, again and again, I guess I should mention, in addition to, well, in the recent votes, even France and Britain, I think most recently France actually voted against the United States and Britain abstained. So it was just the US and then two other European countries and then non-entities. Um, but anyway, yeah, again, we just find ourselves alone. You'll have a vote of like 150 or 155 to 15. And this is what happens again and again. So I think that right there just shows you in a very stark terms, the isolation of the U.S. on this question. Now that's always been there, but it's just now that the focus and the emotional intensity is much greater. It's been a problem that's festered for a long time, but now it's really exploded. And then the U.S.'s position is, something that people were aware of, but now there's a spotlight that's put on it, and it's been really bad for the U.S.
Yeah, it's just becoming so clear to me that the U.S. is in decline, and it's in large part because of our commitments to Israel and to Ukraine, and that this we are furthering our decline through these commitments, and we're becoming increasingly isolated. And it's so obvious to anybody that pays attention to what's going on. But despite this clear damage that we're doing, self-inflicted damage to ourselves, we just keep on doubling down to isolate ourselves further and further. um, until the system, the U.S. system's going to break. I don't know where we're going to see it first. Maybe in the dollar, or I just don't know. I don't know how it's going to all come down. But it's so clear that it's happening right now.